recording. We're gonna get it going. People are coming slowly as I'll be talking right now, but it's 7:03 my time. My clock says 7:03. For those of you just getting here, please fill out the Google form in the chat. But let's get it going. Text your friends, tell them to come through. I think it'll be worthwhile. I always think it'll be worthwhile. But let me resend the Google form right now, just so everybody has it. I hate that Zoom doesn't let you see the chat stuff before. Okay, so thank you all for being here. My name, for those of you who are just signing on or who have been told by somebody else about this event, my name is Marcus Sherman. I recently graduated from USC just this past May, and have been on a bit of a break and have been watching the state of the world and figured we ought to do something about it, you know? And I feel like a lot of people like to talk about things, you know, all the time, but it's just like, what are we actually going to do? You know, can we actually get together and actually figure out ways that, you know, people told me, you know, I don't know where to start, how to educate myself, what to do, you know what? And I was like, as much as we would like to think that it shouldn't be in the people of color's hands to educate the world or the masses or whatever, like, you can really only count on yourself, at least in the first beginning steps. We have to push that first domino, and hopefully y'all will be the next domino that falls, and so on and so on and so on, right? So I want to commend y'all for being with us today. I appreciate you for that. I appreciate all of you for that. And I'm really, really excited to introduce to you Donnell Walton, Dr. Donnell Walton, a research director at Corning Incorporated out in Sunnyvale, California, in Silicon Valley, and Dr. Mebea Aklilu, an oncologist based in Chicago. And I'll let them take away their introductions and everything like that when we transition into the questions portion and have a little bit of like the forum feel. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're here today. We'll do that. We'll have our guests. You know, we have a couple questions to give our guests just to start the discussion going, and then we'll open it up like to the floor. Hopefully, if everybody knows how to use the raise hand function, if you open participants and you see yourself, you should be able to have a raise hand. You click the raise hand button, and if you do that, then your screen pops up like right at the beginning of my screen, and then I can like kind of call on you in like that fashion. I think that seems to work pretty well. But let's see if we can do that. But what are we here to talk about today? Last time it was microaggressions and aggressions and the N-word and the culture of violence against people of color and the oppression of Black people in actuality in this country. And I don't know if y'all remember, but one thing that I really wanted to reiterate last time, and what I want to continue to reiterate today, is that we have to remember that this is not a historical issue. We have to remember that this is not an issue that only affects people outside of our purview or outside the scope of our lives, right? We all have friends who have been on one or the other side of this system, right? And recognizing that it's happening all around us at all times is the first step to be able to assess what needs to be changed and how we can change it, right? You have to understand that it's going on first before you can start to think critically about what needs to change, you know? So that's what I really want to talk about today, and take a much more positive spin on it and talk about the idea of Black success and why I personally feel that if I ever see a successful person of color, I'm exponentially more impressed than when I see a white person who is successful, right? And that's not to say that the white person didn't work for all of their achievements, right? And that's kind of the boiled down argument that a lot of people like to give, is like, well, how do you know that all these people aren't just working hard? Oh, everybody can work hard. That's not the issue, right? But the age old saying, and I'm sure plenty of you have heard either from your parents or from other people talking about it in your vicinity, maybe to you, explaining it to you in their own words, working twice as hard to get half as far or just as far, in some renditions of this phrase, right? The idea that it is twice as difficult, if not more than twice as difficult, for people of color, specifically Black people in this country, because of the systematic, and when I say systematic, I really mean the entire system, and we'll get more into that in a second, but the systematic oppression of these people makes it such that they have to work twice as hard to get anywhere near as far as their fellow student, fellow colleague, their colleague, whatever, who is white, right? And the idea of this system, right? When we talk about the system, I want y'all to recognize and realize that when we talk about the system in the abstract, what are we really talking about? It boils down to the modern day application of what is written into legislation and precedent. And that comes from bills, laws, right? In Congress, in government, passing these orders, these bills, right? And then court cases. And a lot of people have heard, right? Y'all have heard of Brown versus the Board of Education, maybe Plessy versus Ferguson, maybe, right? All of these other, these various cases that have to do Jones and Mayer and all of these court settlements. And there's hundreds that you may not have even ever heard of before in your entire life, right? And these are things that set precedents, right? And just recently we had the transgender court ruling, right? That shocked, I think, most of America, right? That a Republican-controlled Supreme Court can apply the same law that they employed to make gay marriage illegal at one point, not even 10 to 15 years ago, and then set the same precedent, set a completely different precedent now, right? And that really goes to show that it's changes in the hearts and minds of people in power, and allow clear hearts and clear minds and an understanding of this shared experience. Putting those people in positions of power is how we're going to change the application of these precedents, of the systemic nature of the structure of this country, and apply that in a completely new way that puts people of color, that puts Black people at the forefront, right? Deserving, receiving the opportunities that they are more than deserving of, right? And when we talk about stories of like, oh, what does working hard actually mean? Does that mean they have to work twice as hard on homework? No, that's obviously not what we're saying. It's not that simple, right? It means that when I'm going for an internship, I need to find twice as many internship opportunities for myself to apply to hear back from the same amount that you'll hear back from if you only apply to half that. Because it's out of my hands, right? It's the idea that no matter what, I have to go to twice as many interviews. I have to take a lower paying salary in a similar position for a longer period of time, which limits my access to gaining wealth and capital that I can then use to go work for me, right? Those first vital steps in a career, when you have to, just scrape by on pennies, but finally it starts working out. You can save a little bit on the side. And next thing you know, you're able to put a down payment on a house, boom, homeowner, right? But if you're a person of color in that situation and you're, given extra tasks or working extra long hours and not being rewarded for that, you're in the situation where you're living paycheck to paycheck. Let's say you get sick, or you take on a loan that's mud loans that are targeted at Black people and people of color in communities across the country, right? Because you want that house. You want to put the down payment down and start building your wealth and build your family out, right? But what happens if you get a super high interest loan that balloons in 36 months? Next thing you know, you can't pay your interest back. You're still living paycheck to paycheck. You're under thousands of dollars of credit card debt, and they foreclose your home and you end up homeless. That's a story that's all too common for Black professionals in office settings who went to college, 4-year universities, ending up homeless on the streets because of these systematic obstacles that are in their way. But what I want to focus on today is people who are able to triumph over that, who have found ways, who have been tenacious enough and have what some would say the audacity to think that they could strive to the heights that they've striven to. And so I want to let them introduce themselves, but I want to turn it over to Dr. Donnell Walton and Dr. Aklilu and have them kind of tell you a little bit about themselves. And what I really want to say is just pose this question really to get it kind of kicked off. But what do you feel like in your life that phrase working twice as hard, or that philosophy working twice as hard to get half as far, has meant in your lives as you've striven to achieve all that you've achieved? And maybe you want to just, for the group, talk a little bit about your accomplishments, just so they have a little bit more of an understanding of where y'all are coming from. But I'm going to shut up now, put myself on mute, and let them kind of take it away.
I'm going to start very quickly by deferring, because I have a PhD, and my mother would always remind me that it's not a real doctor. So in my mother's spirit, I'm going to defer to Dr. Aklilu, who is a real doctor, unlike me. So please. Very humbling.
Well, it's funny because I started this whole process wanting to get a PhD and I ended up as an MD. So, my name is Mebea Aklilu. I'm a first generation American. My parents are Ethiopian. I was born in Ethiopia and I came to this country when I was 8 years old. So I came here with my older brothers and we lived in the kind of Washington, D.C. area in the suburbs. My father worked for the World Bank and we were able to kind of explore DC and explore the world through his job a little bit. And so I have a different beginning than most African Americans. I am an African American, but I'm also an Ethiopian American. And so I see and view the world in a different way. I started off in college. I ended up at George Washington. My mom was a librarian at George Washington, so we had a free education. So I ended up at George Washington, and I wanted more. I wanted more. And so I ended up at Cornell. It was a humbling experience at being in the college, in a different college, in a different place, because you weren't prepared sometimes. But Cornell was a wonderful gateway to different ways, different experiences, and different people. And I enjoyed my time there. I ended up in medical school in Wisconsin on a scholarship, where after a couple of years out of college, I had no idea what to do in the world. And so I had the opportunity because I'm part of the Ethiopian diaspora. I have relatives all over the world. So I traveled the world. And I traveled the world for a couple of years. I tried to figure out what to do with the world, what to do with myself, what to do. Ended up in a hospital that my uncle was running in Bangladesh. It was a diarrheal disease center in Bangladesh. And that's where I really had my calling, because prior to that, I thought I was going to get my PhD in biochemistry and move on. And it was that experience that kind of taught me to that I really wanted to hone in. I wanted patient care. I wanted to work with people. And I went to medical school with that experience. And, you know, I was a very naive person going into the world. Things somewhat came easily because I had parents that supported me, a community that supported me. But I never really faced obstacles or other ways or other problems, or how I had faced what most, I think, African Americans face in an earlier phase, in a place. Because I was simply naive. I was blind. I had a kind of a blinder to the things that are going on. Things that happened to me, I kind of mentally wrote it off in a different way, is the way I think about it. It's not that it didn't happen to me. It's that I viewed it differently, or I just was so shocked by it, or other ways I explained it away. Wisconsin was a different experience. Medical school was just a wonderful place to be, I'll be honest with you. That was the first place that I really opened up and felt something different. And it wasn't because of the way it was taught, it was because it was the right calling. And that was fundamentally the perfect place for me to be. But, you know, there are, in retrospect, when you see it, there are times where a person of color is viewed differently, and there's no way around it. There are situations where I felt uncomfortable and I wasn't sure what it was. You're in a classroom situation, you are in a ward situation, and you just have somebody who's just not interacting with you. I'm a friendly person. I interact with most people very well. I'm compassionate. I have a good view of myself, and I'm able to read others pretty well. And so I'm able to understand and really get along with most people that I work with. And in most situations it works well, but there are certain situations where I couldn't read it. I couldn't figure out what was going wrong in that situation where it wasn't an appropriate place. To give you an example, when Wisconsin, which is trying to improve their enrollment in minorities, was giving scholarships to other applicants to come in. That's where I came from. I lived in Maryland, but I was able to get a scholarship to come to Wisconsin. And they had a system in place where people coming in from other states or minorities come from other states, they'd want them to start earlier than others to do this anatomy class. And so they called me and said, we want you to do an anatomy class. And I was like, well, thank you, but I have plans this summer. This is my last summer free, and I'm going to travel to wherever I was traveling to at that point. And there was an administrator who was just livid at that suggestion. And for them, it's to protect the minorities because they felt medical school was rigorous, and they wanted to protect us into joining them. And they wanted us earlier, come in earlier, so the first semester would be a less rigorous and helpful. And in their minds was helpful. But it was a difficult place trying to talk to them and say, listen, I understand what you're thinking, but I think I'll be okay. But I want this experience, and I move forward. And it was the first time I felt other. I felt other in that situation. I felt that maybe they didn't think I could make it, that I was starting off in a different way. And that was troubling. I didn't enjoy that feeling, I have to tell you. I've never had that feeling before, and it was the first time where I felt it. And I felt it that first semester. And so despite what you did or how I did, I was always viewed as the minority coming into medical school, and that my achievements, without knowing what my achievements are, they always felt I was struggling. And that was the feeling that was troubling. I found that troubling. And so you find yourself excelling. You find yourself going, nah, that doesn't work for me. And so you want, and so that, and that's not my personality, but that's who you have to be in that situation. And so that was the first experience of the system viewing me different than I viewed myself. After medical school, my first job was in Wake Forest University. I joined the faculty at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. And the South is a different place. And if any of you have ever been to the South, it's different. It's not bad. And I want to make that understand to you. The South is not a bad place. But it is different. And they think and act differently. But the one thing I'll say about the South is that they are overt. Whether they like you or don't like you, you know where you are. Here in Chicago, it's not, I'm not certain, you know what I mean? But in the South, I know where I stand with everybody. And so as a Black physician taking care of people who don't want a Black physician, it was a different experience. And so you have to navigate that situation. You have to come in there. And so I had to, you people can't tell it now, but I am in my 50s, and I look like I'm in my 50s then, but back then I didn't look like I was in my 50s. I looked really young. And so I had to cultivate a different look to be able to be accepted. I looked too young. I was African, and I was in the South. And so there's a lot of barriers in place for me to kind of go there. And so I started graying a little early, so I started showing the gray a little bit more just to look a little older. And then you have to have a little mannerism so you can make sure that everybody around you is comfortable. And so the conversations you have, the way you started the conversation in the South is really different, because it's, you know, people start with, you know, how you doing? Well, I had breakfast this morning. And, you know, that's the kind of mentality that you have. And so you have to kind of cultivate a different way of talking so everybody's comfortable around you as well. And so you have to figure out what to do with that. And so that was the South. And so we'll move on from the South. But after being in medical school, being in faculty for a while, and now I am in a community hospital in an urban setting in Chicago. I treat mostly underprivileged patients. So these are people who are underrepresented, either socioeconomically underprivileged, or they're immigrants as well. And so most of our population are Eastern Europeans, Hispanic, African Americans, who work day by day. Insurance is questionable in the most situation. And they are struggling in the fact that they don't have a high medical literacy. And I deal with cancer. And that requires a high medical literacy to really navigate that situation. And so in that place, I'm now in a comfortable place where I'm working with people who I feel that I can make a difference to. There are people who most times we don't communicate with. I now speak a few words of Polish. I can speak Polish a little bit. I can ask what if they're in pain or what they're feeling or they're in a situation. My Spanish is iffy, but I'm working on that as well. But that's it we are. But the difficult situation that you see every day are people who are working poor, who are faced with a devastating disease, who have a cultural view that is different from mine of what the Western situation views about cancer. And they have a mistrust of the medical care that they're getting, of physicians. And so these are the day-to-day things that we face in our job in our hospital. But overall, not bad. Not a bad thing to do.
Just to kind of piggyback off that, Dr. Aklilu, I was wondering if you could speak as if you were to have any interactions or experiences with patients where they may have prejudged you or your competence as a physician because of your African-American heritage.
You know, mostly that was in the South. And again, they're overt. And so in the South, it's overt. Here in Chicago, they may not be comfortable when we have situations, but I don't really know it. And you know, there are multiple people in the South where you would introduce as a physician. Well, you're not a physician. You know, it's right out there for you. And so you know where you stand. And so there are multiple conversations where you have to say, well, yes, I am the physician. I'm the attending physician. I usually, you know, the hierarchy is pretty simple in a medical situation. You come into a team, you're the attending physician, you have multiple residents that are around you, medical students around you. And it's pretty easy to see the hierarchy in that situation. Absolutely. And so, and most people will see your color and will not accept it, will not accept you being their physician in that situation. It's uncomfortable, but you just have to work through it because ultimately you have to provide care, right? Yeah. That's the situation. Does it make you angry and do you get fired up? Yeah, you do. I mean, there's just no question about it. I mean, it's just, but you learn how to deal with it. These are people who have a different way of doing it, but they're ill.
Right.
You provide the care. You try to be compassionate. You try to be calm. Right. That's the key thing. And so you move on. And some people accept it, some people don't, but they're in a hospital situation and they're ill. But it happens over there. The overt ones are the easy ones. You know where you stand and you're able to move on. It's the difficult ones is where you can't make a connection with that patient and you can't tell why. As most of us recognize, you sometimes have that feeling and what is going on here? I think I know what's going on here. I think I have that, but you can't put that out there every time. And so you have to kind of navigate that through on a daily basis. And so those are the more difficult ones that I find.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes so much sense. And especially because I feel like, if anything, that just speaks to the selflessness and kind of self-reflection that you have to do as a physician, especially being like an African-American physician, because you have to kind of judge and gauge these barriers that people may have. And the important part of being a physician is being able to give people access to the healthcare that you're trying to provide for them, right? And so ultimately, these barriers that may prevent you from doing that, you kind of have to curtail yourself in a certain way in order to be able to better, I guess, connect with them, which is kind of a tough reality that a lot of physicians, I'm sure, have to face, like yourself.
You know, most of the situations I face with are sadly the kind of cancers I do. Most of it is terminal, and so most interactions I have with patients is a difficult situation because they have to face their own mortality or understand their own mortality. And so when they come in there with that kind of news that comes into play, and then they don't have that connection with me because of their fears, it's a difficult place to be. And so it's sad all the way around, right? It is. So you have to find a way for them to find care. Everybody has to connect in some way, and so you try to be as compassionate as possible in that situation.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
very shocking, right? Like, and it's hard. You would think that people that are, you know, to so to speak, on their deathbeds, even at times, you know, are still holding on to those prejudices and are still allowing that to make their own care journey difficult when they're trying to seek treatment because of their pre-existing and completely ingrained internalized behavior, which is really, really tough to, I mean, I honestly have never even thought about that before. That's insane. Yeah. Wow. I want to transition to Dr. Walton, and we'll come back as we have plenty more questions, but we'll come back. But I want to let Dr. Walton introduce himself and kind of talk about what this whole phrase and his experience, you know, how it compares maybe to Dr. Aklilu.
I'll actually be brief with my, can you hear me okay? I'll be brief with my comments because I'd like to get to the questions and the dialogue more. I'm not anywhere near as interesting as this guy. So I'm originally from Detroit, and I moved to North Carolina my junior year in high school. Ended up going to North Carolina State for electrical engineering and physics, and then I ended up going to the University of Michigan to get my PhD in applied physics. So I can resonate with your observances of the South. That's dead on. It's very, very different, very overt. But what I would say, and then after I finished at University of Michigan, my first job, I was on the faculty. I was a professor of physics at Howard University, where I taught for 4 years. And then my wife was a postdoc at National Institute of Science and Technology, so she got a job at Corning. And in order for me to keep my family together, I had to get a job at Corning. So I left Howard, and I've been at Corning for 21 years now. Long time. So you thought you were old as hell. I'm old as hell. And you got anybody here 21? Have I been at Corning longer than you were born? Most of you guys? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. That makes me feel really good. So and I've done different jobs there, everything from a bench scientist, you know, doing laser stuff to, and then most recently I came out and I'm running a lab in Silicon Valley where we work with trying to find the next generation of products and research with Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, all these guys, which is interesting. And it's a lot of fun. As far as working hard, and so I'll tell you the real story behind me. So I was raised by my grandparents because my mother was, you know, she never really matured. So she left me with them. So I spent the first 15 years of my life trying to figure out who I was. And that was very important for me to try to, you know, my mother wasn't there. I didn't know my father. So I was trying to figure out my identity. And then when my grandfather had passed before, I went to North Carolina to live with my aunt. I met my father on my way leaving, and he told me what would motivate me through the next 15 years of my life. When we met for the first time, he told me that, frankly, I was a mistake. You know, I shouldn't have happened. So that was the motivation for me through the next 15 years of my life. I was going to prove that I was no one's mistake. And so whatever sports I played, whatever classes I took, you know, whatever it took for me to work harder, I would do it because that was my motivation. And then that kind of started to fizzle out. And then, you know, it got me through grad school on fire. And there are some stories that I can tell you about that, which are interesting. But then the next 15 years were defined by the birth of my kids. And to be a parent, you know, to be a parent in a context that I was unfamiliar with, not having had parents myself. So that's what was a defining aspect of that chapter of my life. So it's funny how you can look at the things that people do and you really don't ever know, regardless of race, regardless of gender, what really drives them. As a matter, and I'll say one last story. The reason I ended up going to graduate school, I had no idea about graduate school. I was interviewing for different electrical engineering jobs as a senior. I ended up getting into a situation with a policeman. I got arrested. I got the case was dropped, thank goodness. But at that time, as I was a senior in college interviewing, every application would ask the question, have you ever been arrested? So I stopped filling out applications. So a buddy of mine said, hey, have you considered going to grad school? They have a fellowship opportunity with AT&T Bell Labs. I said, does it ask you, have you been arrested? He said, I don't think so. So I applied for fellowship and got a PhD. So it's just very interesting how these things almost are never how they may seem. And I'll tell you 2 quick stories about race. My racial thing was in grad school, you asked a question about being prejudiced. The prejudice toward me, I had 2 PhD advisors. I had one advisor who was from Ghana. He's a brilliant theorist, and another one who was from France. He was white, and he got the Nobel Prize 2 years ago. But because I was affiliated with the African guy, Herb Winful, who everyone knew was a genius, people assumed that I was a genius. So and spoiler alert, I'm not a genius. So, but I didn't know that. You know, I had all of my baggage and everything else. So my first year, I was studying with some friends who were multiracial, no blacks at the time. And I came in and they had these old tests, and they said, "Hey, did you want to see these?" I said, "Of course I want to see them." But I said, "You know what? I don't want to see them." So I walked out, stormed out, decided they were racist, and basically drove myself, the whole mistake thing, to graduating at least a year before the next nearest person graduated to me. And I just was, and then several years later, when I was in DC, one of the my classmates that came in with me, she was a congressional fellow for Daniel Patrick Moynihan. You guys probably heard of him. He did a great study of the black family back in the 60s. Quite the idiot. Anyway, she needed some stuff from me from Howard to do some experiments for her for Congress. And I did them. And then it went really well. She got accolades, and we went out drinking later on. I said, "Hey man, why'd you guys, after we were drinking, that's a social lubricant. I'm sure as recent grads, you guys all know about the social lubrication of drinking." Oh, Alexandra's like, "Hell yeah." So we talked, and I said, "You guys, you really hurt my feelings when you guys didn't share those tests with me." And she goes, "Share the test with you? We didn't think you needed those tests. You were just acing everything, right?" So it's funny how race works. I mean, so she made these prejudices that they put on me based on something completely different, right? And but prejudices are all just that. They're because we don't take the time out to know who people are. If we took the time out to know who people are, then we'll get past these things. But this whole working twice as hard to get half as far, that applies to everybody. That's the only thing that's one of the few things we have control over is how hard we work. We don't have any control over how many people are going to accept our applications. We only have control over our effort that we put out. So do it. It transcends race, it transcends gender. Kick butt when you're doing something. And the other one I tell you is interesting is my first year in grad school, we had this long, and this will be my last story for now. We had this long hallway, and it was so narrow that you had to turn sideways to let someone pass. And it was going back to the bathroom. And there was this professor who would come from the bathroom, and I was going to the bathroom. And right when we get to each other, he turned to the wall so he wouldn't have to see me. He would never made eye contact, never looked at me. And I, in my mind, and talking to my friends who were mostly black, I said, "Man, that guy, what a racist asshole. He's just So, and then I had other friends that would ask me, "Would you want to come drinking with us?" or whatever. I was like, "Nah, whatever." So one night I finally did. I went drinking. I was the only black. It was mostly very, Asians. There were no other blacks in my program. Asians, whites, whatever. And we were all at the bar. And as we were drinking, one of the guys said, "Man, what's up with Ted, the professor? He one of the Asians said he never looks at people when he comes from the bathroom." I said, "Man, what an ass. He's racist against Asians too." And one of the white guys said, "Yeah, man, he must get really embarrassed when he, makes a stinky or something." So apparently this guy was not necessarily racist. He was just super shy and embarrassed and introverted. So he just didn't make eye contact. Fast forward, he has produced probably more black PhDs in physics from Michigan than anyone else has. So it's very interesting how these things work. The story is always more nuanced than it seems. It's very easy to, now am I saying there is no racism? Of course not. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying that the problem with racism is that that's the end of a conversation. It's never the beginning of one. Once we label something as racism, that's it. Person's a racist and you're done with it. And it's almost always more interesting to try to find alternative or more nuanced explanations because racism is not something you can treat, but economic, and I definitely have a question for the other speaker around his current environment and talking about the economically underprivileged, and it seems to be that's transracial. What are some of the differences and similarities across those? So I'll stop there, and like I said, I'd like to open up and have more of a dialogue. I hate hearing myself talk. So.
Yeah, I actually, what was that question you wanted to pose to Dr. Aklilu? That sounded really interesting.
No, so you mentioned where you are now, and when you're doing oncology, you said that you have the patients in which you encounter now are transracial, right? That's probably not the right word. There are many races, right? But what they share is basically an economic background, right? A kind of underprivileged. So are there racial things that are different, or most of their behaviors are really driven by the class, I'll say, the socioeconomic classes?
That's really a difficult thing to try to figure out. And I'll tell you that, oops, sorry about that, guys. So let me answer that in a different way. So my wife's sister, unfortunately, who recently passed away from cancer, a very accomplished lawyer, and her journey through cancer, because she was accomplished and wealthy, was a completely different journey than what I see my patients go through. She had, she in essence, when she got her diagnosis, in essence, didn't have to work. She was so accomplished, the CEOs of where she was working for basically said, we'll keep on paying you, you just take care of yourself. She was able to go to Memorial, MD Anderson, different places, different cancer centers that she's in. So she had a different journey for cancer. The patient population that I see, janitors, security guards, people who need to keep their insurance to work. And whether you're African American, Polish, Hispanic, that drive, that you are faced with a terminal cancer, have to go through multiple courses of chemotherapy that will leave you weak, difficult to work. And at the same time, you have janitors who have to clean up bathrooms, who have to go through chemotherapy. In order to keep their insurance, they have to work. At the same time, they don't have any reserves. Their family members have to work, and so their support system is much smaller. They have no idea what chemotherapy is. When you start a conversation, you have cancer. What is cancer? You have to go over there. So, most of them probably have never finished high school or, in that situation. And so they don't have a real sense of what the journey is like and what's required of them. They're faced with medications that have copays that are thousands of dollars, and they can't afford that.
Right. So that's kind of my point, quick, briefly. So I don't want to be class reductionist, but everything you're saying has nothing to do with race right now, right? It's all about class.
Yes and no, because there's a disproportionate number of people that are minorities who suffer from that.
That are poor.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Exactly. That's something that's treatable. That's where I was going with that.
Yeah, no, and that's the troubling part, and you'll see that over and over again.
Yep.
And so it is, and people make that decision, how many times should I pick up this medicine? Should I pay for rent? Should I pay for water? Those are the kind of things. And so you have social workers that are walking through, you can't have your water turned off because there's things that you can do, but they don't know those systems are in place for them.
Why would they? Correct. Yeah, absolutely.
And so everything is stacked against them in that situation.
Right.
And every once in a while, we'll meet somebody who is highly educated in the neighborhood that's coming in to be treated as well. And it's such a different conversation, and it's so much easier. And then you can see what happens. So here in the Chicago area, there are, because of when the Affordable Care Act came into place, there are certain kind of insurances that came that were difficult. They don't pay as well, that were harder to deal with. And so the academic medical centers here, in essence, just said, there are certain insurances we don't take. If you have those insurances, you can't come here. And so folks that are in the Chicago area who could have access to clinical trials or experts in certain cancers are unable to go to those places just because they don't have these insurances. And these insurances are for people, these aren't private insurances, these are people who are working through that. And it's difficult, and you can see where they're affected by this. And so they completely have no access to a clinical trial that everybody else who has a private insurance may have an access to as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts just a simple matter as that.
Sure.
Just lack of access.
No immunotherapy for the poor. Right? I get you.
You joke about that, but when something costs $50,000 a pop.
Oh, I've lost several relatives because of my jokes don't imply that it's not serious, put it that way.
Oh no, I hear it's really troubling when people have to make a decision about treatment because of it. there are multiple people who make a decision not to get treatment because they want to continue to work.
Okay.
And they feel that by taking treatment, that they can't continue their insurance, and their family members, their insurance depends on them working.
Okay. And that's only exacerbated by current situation.
Yeah. No, it's harder and harder. It's harder and harder to take care of folks.
And I think, just to jump in a little bit, I think that speaks to a compounding issue as well, right? Public health and individual health of a person is also compounded with generally people in this situation that are living paycheck to paycheck, that are living in the low-income housing, that is not necessarily a safe place to live. They're going to schools that are not necessarily designed to be successful. In Rochester alone, which is like my hometown, and like we have a lot of issues, but the Rochester City School District has an agreement with the University of Rochester, because the school superintendents, the entire structure, the whole administrative structure of the Rochester City Schools failed. And they had to approach the university, and the university had to take over this administration. And this school district served predominantly Black and Puerto Rican students. Their graduation rate was sub 50%. Most of their students dropped out within 1 month of turning 16, which is the legal age at which you can drop out of New York State, right? And these people, why are they dropping out? To solve some sort of financial crisis that's occurring within their own home. Almost always, it's to work, to make money, to pay some bills that need to be paid off, right? And if we're thinking about what happens when a family member gets sick, yeah, people can think in the abstract, okay, it would be bad, if my mom got sick. I would feel really, really terrible and not be able to focus on my schoolwork. But people in this situation, it's not, oh, I won't be able to focus on my schoolwork because I feel my mother's pain as she's going through treatment. It's, I have to physically spend less time at school, on school. I have to drop out, take semesters, take years off, put my education on hold so that I can go make a little bit of money to try and pay down some of the debt that was caused from these hospitals, just like Dr. Aklilu was saying, charging $50,000 for series of treatments, that may or may not work. At the end of the day, it becomes 6 or 7 added layers of burden. It's not just one person in your household is sick. It's a domino effect that falls and affects, kind of the rest of the household. And so when we talk about these added strains on houses, low incomes and low socioeconomic status households, which also happen to be, for a number of reasons that we seem to be understanding more and more today, are households of color in America, we're seeing a lot of these patterns recurring, and people being stuck in these cycles of not being able to access that next level of education, not being able to access that better care, and not being able to make more money, because at the end of the day, at least in my mind, the world runs on money. If you can make that money, and you can make sustainable money over the long term, is really the only way that you can really set yourself up. But I want to transition here so we don't run out of time. I want to open it up to everybody to be able to ask questions if they want to ask questions. If y'all can use the raise your hand function or just shoot them in the chat, we can direct them to either Donnell or Dr. Aklilu, or me or Sharad, whoever. And if anybody has comments, either if y'all want to do the raise hand function and just say something, feel free. I just want to open it up to the floor, you know what I'm saying? If you can't find the raise hand function, is in participants, if you have that open. But if anybody just wants to unmute themselves and start talking, y'all can do that too.
Better ask questions, or I'm going to start asking questions.
Yeah.
I have plenty.
Yeah, Mari, go for it.
Hi, Mari. I have a question for Dr. Aklilu. And you touched on how when you were in the South, there was overt racism of patients towards you. Did you witness any the other way around, where some of your coworkers who were not Black or not a person of color have racist views towards patients who were either Black or a person of color? Like, did it go both ways? Is kind of what I'm asking.
That's one of the things that social media has kind of taught me a little bit about some of my coworkers' views. I personally don't have Facebook. My wife is also an oncologist and we work together. And so she has Facebook, and over years she's kind of filled me in on people that we work with and their views on life, on current situations and everything else. And it is troubling. I have to tell you, and it's saddening because these were people who are coworkers, and these were people that I felt were close. And then when you actually find some of their views that were so antithetical of what I felt was what I wanted from a friend, that it was troubling. So in a day-to-day situation, I didn't see it until I left. But now with social media, I'm able to actually see what people actually see and post and say. And again, it really reinforces that I should just stay away from social media. And it made it much easier for me to live a normal, happy life in that situation.
Most important takeaway from today. Stay off social media.
Thank you.
Anybody else? I got more
I was
questions.
about to say, I also have questions for you, so go ahead.
Yeah, I got more questions. So I actually wanted to throw it back to both of you in the tech industry and in the medical field, respectively. Do you feel like they're, in terms of, this is kind of more turning it back on the professionals within the industry, but do you feel like, Dr. Aklilu, you were talking about, so on social media, you've seen, people and examples of people who are being exposed for this certain types of behavior, right? But in general, we have to kind of assume that, most people are, at least I assume, most people are generally good. Like they're trying, or they just, don't know. But do you feel like in the tech industry and in the medical field, do you feel like we're going in the right direction? Do you feel like you're seeing things around you that give you hope that there will be some sort of kind of equity? People are taking into account the differences, not just ignoring or saying, oh, we don't see any differences caused by color. We don't see any differences caused by, people like to say that we can really accept socioeconomic status difference because that seems to be a very money factor, right? But we don't see color, so we don't see how all of our physicians should be, have the same bedside manner for any patients, or in the tech industry, right? All of our products should be designed for everybody in mind, right? But that's not necessarily the case, right? But are you seeing things that are going in the right direction? What are you seeing from the inside in these industries that either is upsetting or gives you hope, like for this journey?
Please go ahead.
Well, for tech industry, I'll say two things. One is techies are antisocial nerds in general. So we don't go outside of our small boxes in which we live, but we're smart, so we think and we mistake knowledge with intelligence. So it's very easy, and one of the things that we do very well as techies is we sort things. We sort people based on their height, on their hair texture, on their hair color, on their body type. But we don't sort people based on their generosity or their kindness. So it's very interesting. It's very easy for us to compartmentalize people. That's too bad. And that's something that's been going on more and more and more. The thing that gives me the biggest hope right now is what has happened in the wake of the recent I'll call them the George Floyd protests and the Donald Trump riots that have been going on at the same time. The fact that we see people talking about Black Lives Matter in Tokyo, Japan, and some of these old, generational racist ideologues in the sense of statues coming down in Bristol, England. This is huge. And the fact that these protests have been intergenerational, multiracial. They haven't just been, localized to poor areas. Santa Monica was was trashed, Geneva, Switzerland. So people have decided that some things are wrong and some things need to change. So I've given great hope. I have no idea what it's going to look like, but I'm giving great hope for you guys and to undo some of the mess that my generation made for you. So good luck.
Thanks. Dr. Aklilu, do you want to?
I think the biggest issue in medicine for me has always been the first and fundamental issue has been underrepresentation. You know, when I was growing up in the United States, when you asked me what a doctor was, it was an old white man with gray hair, right? And that's my sense of that. And so I think in the first sense of that is we have to really change our views of a physician, how we're comfortable as a physician. When you look at medical school kind of graduation photos from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, present days as well, you first see that more women start coming into play. That's the first change I think that we've kind of seen as well. And what I'm seeing from medical schools now is a greater representations of minorities in graduating classes. And so we just have to have more people of color. And so we have to have more people in place where I'm not the only one. I don't want to be the only person in the hospital where I'm the only one anymore. I don't want to be in a practice situation. I don't want a patient to have seen only me as their only Black physician that they've had ever in that situation. And so if we change that representation, that numbers, that simple change alone, I think will have a greater impact. And we're seeing that in medical schools.
So I don't mean to interrupt you, but how do you see that change happening, right? In med schools or in the selection process, or removing some of these barriers? Like, what is it going to take to get those representation numbers up? And then also kind of as an add-on point, how do you feel that we can do that without making it feel inauthentic? That it's just a diversity tick, that it's just, you know.
Yeah. I'll actually say something to that. So if you actually look at census data, if you go from ages 0 to 15 in the United States right now, whites are not in the majority, right? So that's the fundamental demographics of the denominator are changing. So regardless of the old guard, no matter what they want, you know, the things you're talking about, it's just a numerical. If you want doctors, you're going to have to do something different. That's just a physics reality of the numbers now.
I guess, yeah, kind of going off of that, Dr. Aklilu, I guess in your experience throughout the whole formal education process of becoming a physician, do you feel as though there are some institutional changes that could be made, whether it be at the secondary school level, whether it be like high school or even younger, that could, I guess, produce more physicians of color, like, I guess, perpetuate people of color to start engaging in higher powered positions, whether it be a physician or a tech director, whatever it may be, lawyer, anything like that?
You know, here in Chicago, we have a wonderful system called the Chicago Public School System, and wonderful is a different way of calling it. And so I have my I have my two kids in a private school. And part of the reason we came back to Chicago is we wanted no part of the Chicago public school system for them, because I thought it put too much pressure on that situation. And is it a cop-out? Absolutely, absolutely. But you can see the difference in the Chicago public school system and others, and so how it prepares others. If you first start, if you remember my conversation about when I went to college, people that are prepared for college who have had that educational system in preparation up to that area excel. But if your first experience of a rigorous education is college, you sometimes lose out. It's difficult. You're always behind. And so I think it's the Chicago public school system, public school systems in general, or people who are socioeconomically deprived right now, who have one parent, who have multiple people who are left alone, who don't have that access to extracurricular activities or different things, they are less prepared. And so I think it's difficult to produce people in the science industry because it's so, that first secondary education system, primary, secondary, is so critical. Math, it's difficult. I mean, the math skills of some of the Chicago public schools reading, fundamental things. The scores that you see are just so scary in this. And it's not a fault. It's just the system is just not prepared to handle that. And so you can see where it is. So it's not my kids who are in private school that are at risk. And, you know, yes, is it a cop-out? But I'm going to take that risk. I want them to have that education. I want them to have that step up. But you can see there are a multitude of people in Chicago that don't have that in place. And they're not prepared. And so what happens when they go to college? What happens when they fight and they go to college and they end up in college in a scholarship in this place, or they with merit? They're not as prepared as others. And so you can see the difficulty. And so I think it's access to care. We have to somehow change that primary and secondary education system.
And the only way we can change that is by changing people like Betsy DeVos. That's the only way.
That her views of the world is difficult. It's just so different, right? Just the way she views that, and just how can we be human beings together? I don't understand. Somehow my brain is wired somewhat differently? Is it how are we so different?
The answer to your question, yes, your brain is definitely wired very differently than Betsy DeVos's. Yes, thank God.
Yeah.
I'll jump in here, and for those of you that don't know, I'm an incoming middle school teacher, middle school history teacher, specifically because I think we need to start teaching the correct history in schools, because we've been lied to our entire lives and for generations before us because of the dominant narrative, right? And I think that social science and the idea of social emotional learning and all of these newer educational tools and mediums that we're able to access, incorporating trauma reduction and incorporating social emotional learning and incorporating movement for learning. It's all going to work towards this singular goal of opening children's abilities, expanding children's abilities and horizons within academia by opening other parts of their minds, other parts of their spirits, right? And allowing them to identify, if I can really understand how I'm feeling today and know what my body needs and know what my mind needs, I can excel in the classroom. And if I'm being fed, narratives that I am lesser than every day, I am not going to feel like I can succeed in the future, right? And that's what these students are hearing, what a lot of students of color hear in the classroom when they're so young, not overtly like we discuss in the South, right? In certain examples, it's I don't see my own history that I can actually identify with on the PowerPoint. I don't learn about stories of my ancestors other than as helpless, defenseless people who were caught up in this mass system as a mass statistic, not as an individual story, not even as the whole story, right? We don't learn about the entirety or the indemnity of slave culture that happened, right? And we learn about this as a historical event rather than as a currently happening system. All of this plays in to the idea that students are being set back every day. Students of color are being set back every day, denied opportunities, whether it be overtly or covertly, to access this next rung of education. They're not prepared when they go into these high pressure environments, these high pressure schools. My USC family, y'all know, first day on campus, first week, first year, first semester, the entire thing was the struggle bus, the definition of the struggle bus, right? If we're still going through it, if y'all are still going through it, like I commend every person that's able to complete what needs to be done, right? And it's not just the coursework, it's the added internship and it's the campus job and it's the 9 million clubs, right? And especially if you think about when you're tying socioeconomic status into this and you have a student of color who comes from a low SES background and they have to work 30 plus hours a week to be able to pay their own rent, they're denying themselves opportunities for extracurriculars that they have to pay money for because they don't have that money. How can you advance your own, if you're able to sign on to something like a solar car team and pay $500 to go travel across the country driving around a test car as an engineer, fantastic. Google will notice you at that competition and sign you right up, right? But what if you are stuck working at a CVS desk because you just need that money for rent, right? At every step of the way, there's these various different obstacles, and I know I'm getting preachy, but I cannot iterate that enough. that to change these high levels, to change who's in the positions of power, it starts at that base level in the primary, secondary education system, and fundamentally altering what we value as a society in a person, and recognizing that all people are capable of greatness from the beginning, and chanting that mantra like it's our jobs to those children so that they truly believe that they can access and achieve anything to the heights and of whoever, beyond anybody's wildest expectations. And I'm thankful that I've had a support network and parents who have gone through that journey that have supported me to where I'm at right now, right? And I'm using this position to go and try and better the lives of these low SES students in Flatbush, Brooklyn. And not everybody can do that. And thankfully I was afforded that opportunity, right? But my challenge to all of y'all is to figure out how to best use your talents to change the system, whether it be advocating for someone else, a colleague on your level, or immediately getting to that when you're in that position of power, when you're in that management position, critically thinking about how you want to construct your team, what you value in a team member, in a hiree. Any of these questions, you're asking yourself, really, do I truly know how to make unbiased decisions, to practice unbiased selection of employees, and giving kids who may not have had the chance before that chance, when you are in that position. So we're catching you now when we're all just graduated, but in a couple years, when we're starting to climb those ladders, right? Help the people up the ladder. You know what I'm saying? But I'll turn it over to Donnell. I'm curious what questions you have for us, for the group.
Well, now I have one for you. How are you going to change your curriculum at your charter school in light of standardized testing? But the second one is, how is the world going to be different now in light of we can't go back before these protests? What's going to be different now?
I'll answer your first question first, and then I'm actually going to defer to Sharad for the second one. But for the standardized testing, right, I think that's a fundamental issue. State testing, regions testing in New York, California state testing, Texas, Oklahoma. Almost half the states, I would say about half the states, have some sort of state testing that starts as early as first grade, that constructs a school system where teachers teach to tests. They're rewarded when their students do well on those tests. So they teach even more to those tests, the ins and outs of that test, exactly how you have to think for that test, right? And that test was very much in the past, was designed on fundamental education principles that we don't even teach in education schools anymore, right? And we're looking at these tests as if there's some sort of like living testament to apathy or aptitude, right? And we're looking at the Regents exam and saying, oh yeah, as long as an 11th grader can do enough DBQs in an hour to explain that they have a knowledge of what Reconstruction was, they're definitely ready to contextualize history for the future of their lives. Like, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I think charter schools are doing their best to work within the state testing environment to combine expand their curriculum to work around the test. So you teach what needs to be on the test and you develop the skills that can be transferable to taking the test, but also have that real life, what we call executive skills and executive functioning, right? Decision-making skills, starter, initiator qualities, and there's a whole list, right? But just
the prefrontal cortex. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And focusing on that EQ as well as that IQ. And I think charter schools keep kids in school for longer because their curriculum is expanded. And at my school, obviously, I'm not completely familiar with it yet. They have all of it on an online database, so I've looked through it a little bit, but I'm confident that they are committed to looking internally with themselves, right? But I'm a little bit disheartened because why does it need to be one charter school here, one charter school there, this network over here? Our network has 43 schools and growing, which is a lot, and especially in a major hub like New York City, that's a lot. But around the country, around the world, we still have hundreds of thousands of schools that still operate in these archaic systems, right? So how are we going to change the Department of Education or this individual state's Department of Education, because education is really on a state level, right? How do we revolutionize each one of these individual states' education practices to go along with what we're learning, today. And I think personally, a lot of that has to do with connecting what's being produced in psychological, pediatric psychology, and figuring out educational psychology and the research that's going on, and then finding a faster way to apply that to what we're doing in actuality in the classroom, right? So say this paper came out 6 months ago, this is the new curriculum we're experimenting with, try it in your classrooms. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and we'll register that it didn't work, we'll understand why it didn't work, and we'll continue to move, right? And if schools didn't have the state test, they'd have the freedom to do that without feeling like they're failing their kids. But because there is this consistent backstop of every year, 7 tests in all subjects, time and time again, right? And there's a whole weeks of testing, right? They're trained to think in this very Pavlovian dog way. And it's really unfortunate. So I'm not a fan of standardized testing at all. I think it should all be abolished, and project-based learning should be the way that all kids learn always, all the time. But that is going to be really difficult. It would require hundreds of thousands of more teachers, which is going to be really difficult if teacher salaries remain this low, this abysmal, right? And it's going to require hundreds of thousands of dollars of more resources to each individual district for technology improvements, for classroom improvements, right? I really like, actually, in Chicago, some of the experiments that they're doing with the 6-year high schools, where you graduate with an associate's degree on top of your high school degree. I think that is a phenomenal idea that we really should be investing more time and money into. So there are things out there that are happening, right? What really becomes the question is, where is the money going to come from for any of this? Who do we look to get this grant, right? We're looking down the barrel of a shotgun filled with austerity measures that are probably going to hit education, clean energy, and public health if Donald Trump can help it, right?
The military, yeah.
No, never the military. Come on, Walton, right? And so if we can't get it from the federal government, what do we look to? Corporations? Sure, maybe they're doing their name donations and setting up maybe a scholarship fund at some university here or there, but we need large-scale fundamental change in this system, and we need money to do it, and we need some sort of leadership structure outside of the ties of state or national governments that can pioneer this sort of change. So that's my answer to that question. I'll transition. I'll let Sherrod take it over to give you some speculation about where are we going from here, man. You're on mute.
He knows. Oldest trick in the book.
Sherrod, you're on mute.
All right, how about that? All right, fantastic. Sorry, what I was trying to say is very tough to follow up Marcus with his very eloquent speech, as always. But I think it's, I guess specifically speaking from a non-Black person of color, like the George Floyd protests, as you call them, and the Donald Trump riots. What's really interesting, despite what Dr. Aklilu has brought to attention of being a really negative thing about social media, is also something that's incredibly connective towards especially people in our generation, because I think a lot of kids up until now, I mean, in our first episode, we talked with, I guess there was a lot more dialogue between all the other members, but a lot of people were kind of talking about how, the most thing that they didn't understand was experience and trying to hear other people's experiences through racial prejudice and other things like that. So I guess when we're specifically speaking towards police brutality and how that is, very much more centered around Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, whether that be Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Elijah McClain, like all of these things that we're now regularly on a day-to-day basis reminded of. Like, I guess the hope is for me that people in our generation continue to be aware that this is not something that is a brand new phenomenon. This is not something that is a just now thing. This has been happening like generationally. This is something that will continue to happen as long as major reform isn't made. I mean, I know a lot of people have, there's like kind of a negative connotation to the whole abolition of police, but my friend Oscar, who's on, he made a really awesome point, and Bill Clinton used to say, like, we're going to reform healthcare as we know it. And I think that's kind of a really important way to think about it. I think reforming the police as we know it is a really important step in reforming the way that, like, societally people perceive Black Americans, people of color. Because the thing is, when it really boil it down, a lot of Americans believe that the only way to success as a person of color is like, whether it be sports or music or other things that are really just kind of dime a dozen, or like 1 in a million shots, but really like hard work and all of the things that you guys have displayed or talked about over the past 45 minutes to an hour is really what's important to instill in young people. And I guess kind of going off that, it's like being able to educate people, like not only ourselves, but, having these conversations with with adults that may not necessarily agree with us, continuing to perpetuate the knowledge downwards as we move generationally. So as we age, to continue to hopefully let our children know, like the reality of it is, for a very long time, people were misled with a lot of history, or just misled with a lot of things. The government has a very specific agenda set forward to ultimately like put certain people, whether that be white males, in spaces of, comfortability and spaces of high access to opportunity. And a lot of people don't have that. And ultimately what a lot of POCs and a lot of Black Americans have to face is that the abridged amount of opportunity. And so I guess the thing that I would say is, hopefully throughout these talk series, throughout, hopefully everybody else that's on here, like talking to their folks, talking to friends, everybody about it, it's like, it has to be kind of like what Marcus said, a very like short, arduous, but like prolonged institutional change. There's no such thing as a short reform on stuff like this when it's almost 500 years of systematic institutional oppression.
Say that. Exactly. I promised we would cut it off at 8:15. This has been amazing. I have one final request from our two speakers, but as you may have noticed, most of the people that are on this call right now are pretty young. We're like recent graduates. We're just like stepping out into the world, trying to figure out what the hell we can try and do in these circumstances, but I would ask, just, you are both very, very wise people. Do you have any advice just for the ubiquitous person entering the world, just trying to figure it out?
It's okay to fail. That's the one thing I'll tell you about most things that you do, is that there is no perfect place or job or thing that you want to, that is out there for you. There is no perfect job. The most important thing for me is, when I was at your age right now, is just really understanding what it is I wanted of my life and what it is that I wanted. Not the future, what it is that I wanted to do. And I think if you can answer that question, that you will work it through. But if you can't have a sense of what it is that you want to do, or what it is that drives you, then that's where it becomes difficult. If you find what you like and you are working hard and you fail at it, it's okay. It's okay. Life doesn't end that place, and then you move on. And so we all fail. And what was important to you and what you consider a failure at 21, 22, at 31, 32 is going to be completely different. And so you got to have that long view in some places. But more important than anything, I am so worried about for you guys, because it is such a different world than when I grew up with. There are so many limitations. There are so many different obstacles to your care, and it is difficult. And I worry about you, and I worry about my children. But I'll tell you that you guys are so aware than I was, and so much. Your maturity level that I see at this age is astounding. I was nowhere near what some of you guys are doing or thinking about, not even close. And so I am pleased, and I am hopeful for you. But what I'll tell you to do is just find what you love. And it seems so cliched, right, to say that? Find what you love. It's easy. It doesn't have to be. Say it in a different way, but find what it is that you are passionate about. That's the first step, more than anything else.
Thank you. That's very, I think a lot of people definitely need to hear that more than, once in a lifetime. So thank you for that. And thank you for participating and imparting your wisdom and sharing your experience. I really, really appreciate it. I know we haven't met in person or formally, but thank you for taking the time out of your I'm sure, very busy life to speak with us today. And this session will be recorded, and we're blasting it out. And actually more people watch the recording than are able to attend the live session. So, which is great for us that it still exists in recording form, that we can continue to spread it out to everybody. But Dr. Walton, I just want to turn everybody's attention to what Dr. Walton just put in the chat real quick before we wrap everything up. What to learn. Learn to learn, learn to lead, to listen, to think critically, to not give up, and so on. I encourage you all to copy this out of the chat, paste it into somewhere where you'll be able to access it again, because these are incredibly poignant things that we should definitely be paying attention to. I wanted to...
Something I wrote to my kids who were 22 and 20. They don't worry, they ignored it too. So.
Well, I'm telling y'all, don't ignore it. It's very, it's definitely helpful. And I want to actually just to throw it back to you. So 20 and 22-year-old kids, like my dad did a similar thing to me when I was a sophomore in college. We had a very intense conversation about whether or not I should transfer, because I felt USC there was too much red tape. I was hitting too many walls and I wanted to leave, right? And after that whole conversation, a couple weeks later, he sent me this very weird email, and I had never really thought about the economics of a successful Black man. Thinking about the cost benefit analysis of what I had to go through, that life was a game of calculations, and that we had to choose what the next step in this whole path was. And we had to learn from that decision, learn from that choice, and weather the storm to be able to look back and be able to register what was happening. And the kind of whole moral of the story that he said was, when you're faced with these tough decisions, you have to think about how it's going to affect you in the eyes of other people, or you're tempted to think about how it's going to affect you in the eyes of other people. But you have to really look at how it's going to affect you when you look in the mirror. And that has stuck with me for however many years, I guess 3 years now, but will stick with me, I'm sure, forever. And I make these decisions. I put together this Zoom session. I for those of you that do know me, I've lived in boxes in Cambodia and all this, and I've done all of those things. And it seems like, it was for the adventure, but it was all very calculated, because I knew that in that tough decision moment, I had to look at myself and say, what do I need to see in the mirror when I look back at myself? I need to see somebody that made the right decision for not only myself, but for the world, right? And I encourage you all to look at yourself in the mirror every time you face one of these tough decisions. And maybe, just maybe, we'll end up somewhere nearly as successful as these two great gentlemen that have joined us tonight. So I want everybody to give them a round of applause. There's a little reaction button. You can even do the round of applause button, but I will give a round of applause for you. Thank you to Dr. Walton and Dr. Aklilu. Thank you all. Y'all can toss it in the comments. I will be adding there, I'll add your information to the list. And if there's anything else that you want to send out, to the general population, send it through me, and I can get it disseminated out to everybody. For one last time, I'm gonna try and send the Google form for the email list, so that there's one central place where we can have all this discussion. But I will stop talking now and end the meeting and let these gentlemen go on their very busy way. But thank you all for being here. I really, really appreciate it. And we'll see you in 2 weeks, okay?
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Likewise.
Bye, guys.